Good day, everyone. I am Van Isel M. Rabino from Social Work 104, Section C1. For today's report, I am going to discuss about the trauma theory. A trauma is an emotional response to terrible events like an accident, rape, or a natural disaster. Immediately after the event, shock and denial are typical. There are also longer-term reactions which include unpredictable emotions, flashbacks, strained relationships, and even physical symptoms like headache and nausea. How did trauma theory started? Trauma studies began in 1860s as clinicians began to notice victims of railway accidents having prolonged and unusual reactions that extended their physical injuries. In the 1980s, the doctors began psychological examinations of primarily women suffering from odd behavior with no apparent cause. Hysteria is a psychological disorder whose symptoms includes conversion of psychological stress into physical symptoms or what we call somatization, selective amnesia, shallow volatile emotions, and overdramatic or attention-seeking behavior. Their hysteria was initially considered a feature of their gender's weakened condition. Showalter points out that while these explanations emphasized the element, they were not blind to the significance of the particular constraints, restricted activity, and sexual repression placed on women. That is why some blame Freud's theories of sexual development for the continued misogyny against women. The trauma theory emerged in the 1960s from several areas of social concerns such as recognition of the prevalence of violence against women and children like rape, battering, and incest. Identification of phenomenon of post-traumatic stress disorder in some countries or war veterans are also recognized, and awareness of the psychic scars inflicted by torture and genocide, especially in regard to Holocaust. Although Freud denied the reality of incest in the stories he heard from his early women patients, he chose to direct his attention to the drama of internal conflict instead. Likewise, Sigmund Freud's psychic and disillusionments prompted to speculate on the pathology inflicted by the war experience. Yet, his inclination towards grand narrative led him away from an investigation of how traumatic experience affects individuals towards the realm of universal theory, culminating in his formation of death instinct. Feminists have played and continue to play a major role in the field of trauma studies. Some of their actions are the calling of attention to the issues that affect women and children such as physical and/or sexual abuse, female sexual slavery, and genital mutilation. Second is the practice of sati. Third is the bride burning. And lastly, the honor killing, not to mention rape as a routine weapon of terrorism. Kolk said that the mind confronted with an overwhelming experience tends to isolate the memories associated with his experience in specific areas of the brain that are inaccessible to conscious recall and hence integration into the subject's ongoing narrative of his or her life story. Also, the talk therapy, which is advocated by Freud, does not really access these split-off areas of neurosubjective awareness. Freud is central to an understanding of the meanings and trajectories of 20th century. There is no single Freud whose work can be understood in monolithic terms. Monolithic terms means unchanging and uniform. If the intellectual history of the second half of the 20th century has taught us anything, it is that the naive of Freud's text lies precisely in their polyvalence and polysemy, exemplifying the very aspects of conscious and unconscious interplay that first engaged in him. Sigmund Freud and the development of psychoeconomic model of trauma. In the treatment of female patients who had developed hysterical symptoms, Freud has confronted with episodes of sexual seduction in the post-puberty phase of development. In his estimation, however, these episodes were not sufficient to explain the illness. The patients who have been sexually seduced in the childhood led Freud to assume that a pre-pubertal trauma was involved. Freud came to the conclusion that a traumatization could be inanimate from internal forces. It was the First World War which forced Freud and his followers to deal again with the traumatic neurosis and pathogenic effect of the factors in the outside world. Then, a psychoeconomic dimension came to the fore. Freud describes the ego as being absolutely helpless in view of unbearable excitation in the traumatic experience. Finichel also defines trauma as an excessive quantity of excitation that cannot be bound, so that the traumatic effect of an extent depends on how unexpectedly it occurs. According to Barringer and Mom, 1988, we can only adequately get the core of a traumatic experience if we also take the overwhelming destructive anxiety into consideration. This anxiety can only be described in psychoeconomic terms. If the authors postulate a pure trauma in theory, then this also means, on the other hand, that a psychoeconomic model alone is not sufficient. For there is no trauma without a remnant of internal structures that give meaning. The massive traumatic experience then shatters this basis by destroying the confidence in the common symbolically mediated word. Secondly, the experience of being overwhelmed should also be mentioned here. The recurring intrusion of fragmented traumatic memories can also be a traumatizing effect because of this, too, has the quality of being sudden and immediately overwhelming. Third, traumatized patients often report feeling that time is standing still or that their mental clock stopped on the date they were traumatized. They still have the sense of objective time, but not for their own development and lifetime, especially not for their future. Trust also affects their sense of time, and with its destruction by the trauma, time also gets out of hand for the traumatized person. The psychoanalytic theory of trauma needs both models. At the psychic level of experience, the psychoeconomic model, for which the shock trauma is paradigmatic, emphasizes the experience of being overwhelmed and an excess of violence, anxiety, and stimulation cannot be bound mentally. The object relations theory models with the collapse of the internal supporting object relations put the feeling of utter abandonment and the disruption of any and all effective bonds. Only because of this breadth of phenomena, it could not be assumed that the effects and consequences of trauma were homogeneous. These pictures show the pluralistic trauma theory, a new model. Criticism also developed a theoretical pluralism that pushes directly against the traditional Cartesian model. The pluralistic model of trauma challenges the unspeakable trope of seeking to understand not only the structural dimensions of trauma that often develop in terms of trauma's disassociative effects of consciousness and memory, but also the cultural dimensions of trauma and diversity of narrative expression. Pluralistic model suggests that traumatic experience uncovers new relationships between experience, language, and knowledge that detail the social significance of trauma. The study of trauma within this approach provides greater attention to the variability of traumatic presentations. In this model, trauma is conceptualized as an event that alters perception and identity, but in the wake of such disturbance, new knowledge is formed about the self and the external world. The orientation of consciousness caused by traumatic events may include the ambiguous referentiality as well as a determinate meaning, allowing the trauma's variability in terms of its causes, effects, and representative potential demonstrates the diverse values accorded to a traumatic event and resemblance. The experiences like rape, war, the Holocaust, the Gulag, American slavery, colonial oppression, and racism enables greater attention to represent extreme trauma. Naomi Mandel, Ants Vetkovich, and Greg Forter demonstrate in their work a pluralistic trauma model that, although influenced to greater or lesser degrees by the foundational Freudian concepts of trauma, extend a critical analysis beyond the shattering trope, in large part by emphasizing the cultural dimensions of trauma. In the wake of World War II, the Nazi genocide of European Jews has come to stand for the unspeakable, posing crucial challenges to the presentation of suffering, the articulation of identity, and the practice of ethics in the increasingly multinational and multicultural world. In her analysis of trauma and paradoxes of memorialization into Toni Morrison's novel Beloved, Mandel writes that silence and forgetting are much a strategic and self-conscious gesture on the part of the subjugated, as they are the product of subjugating culture's demands and requirements. In this bold new work of cultural criticism, Anne Svetkovich develops a clear approach to trauma. She argues and found importance of recognizing and archiving accounts of trauma that belong as much to the ordinary and everyday as the domain of catastrophe. She challenges the field to engage more fully with sexual trauma and the wide range of feelings in its vicinity, including those associated with botched film sex and AIDS activism and caretaking. Greg Forter's early work in gender, race, and mourning in American modernism employs and adopts the Freudian-Cartesian trauma model to emphasize the difference between punctual trauma and non-punctual trauma. The field of trauma studies continues to develop and adopt the foundational post-structural as well as incorporate new perspectives from post-colonialism, feminist theory, ethnic studies, and eco-criticism in scholarships that examines trauma significance in literature and society. The three types of trauma is acute trauma, chronic trauma, and the complex trauma. Acute trauma is mainly caused by an accident, rape, assault, or a natural disaster. The event is extreme enough to threaten the person's emotional or physical security. People with acute trauma may feel an excessive anxiety, panic, irritation, confusion, inability to have a restful sleep, feeling of disconnection from surroundings, unreasonable lack of trust, inability to focus on work or studies, lack of self-care or grooming, and aggressive behavior. Chronic trauma happens when a person is exposed to multiple, long-term, and/or prolonged distressing traumatic events over an extended period. Several events of acute trauma as well as untreated acute trauma may progress into chronic trauma. The symptoms may show unpredictable emotional outbursts, anxiety, extreme anger, flashbacks, body aches, headaches, and nausea. These individuals may also have trust issues and hence they do not have stable relationships or jobs. The third type of trauma is the complex trauma. It is a result of exposure to varied and multiple traumatic events or experiences. It may be seen in individuals who have been victims of childhood abuse, neglect, domestic violence, family disputes, and probably it affects the person's overall health, relationships, and performance in school or work. Whatever the type of trauma, if a person finds it difficult to recover from the distressing experiences, they must seek timely psychological help. A qualified psychologist can help the person with a traumatic experience lead a fulfilling life.